This prime piece of land will belong to us, no matter what. And from that sentence, a terrifying plan was set in motion, without limits. They didn't target the man. They went after his dog to break him. A proud Navy SEAL, forged by war, but guided by a deep love for his loyal companion. When the law turned its back and fear spread through the quiet town, quiet justice began to rise. But would he be forced to give up his dog? Tell us where you're watching from, and remember to like and subscribe. Spring arrived in the north the way mercy sometimes did. Quiet, bright, and stubborn. The village of Clearwater sat cradled between a glacial lake and a ring of pine and maple, the kind of place postcards tried to imitate and always failed. Morning light skimmed across the water like a hand smoothing wrinkled linen. The air smelled of thawing earth and cold sap, and the wind carried a clean bite that reminded every living thing winter had only just loosened its grip. On the eastern edge of town, where the road turned to gravel and the gravel turned to nothing but deer paths and memory, a weathered cabin stood with its porch facing the lake. It wasn't grand. It wasn't new. It looked like it had been built to last, not to impress. Cedar boards silvered by seasons, a roof patched more times than a politician's promises, a wind chime that never quite stopped talking. Inside that cabin lived Nathan Nate Calloway. He was 35, about 6 foot flat, built lean and efficient strength, kept like a knife kept sharp, not like a trophy kept polished. He didn't carry the loud kind of muscle. He carried the kind that showed up when a truck got stuck in mud, when a neighbor's generator refused to start, when a storm knocked a tree down across someone's driveway, and the only chainsaw in town decided it had feelings. Nate was clean-shaven, no beard, no stubble. His face shaved close enough to expose the geometry of discipline. A square jaw, defined cheekbones, and a calm mouth that looked like it had once learned to smile and then learned when not to. His hair was dark brown, clipped in a military cut, but grown a touch longer than regulation, as if his life had made room for freedom, but not for chaos. The cold northern wind had browned him lightly, a pale skin tone weathered by days outside, and his eyes, gray-green, the color of lake water under cloud, held a steady alertness. Not judging, just awake. He wore the same clothes nearly every day, not from poverty, but from preference. An old tactical combat shirt in olive gray, softened and faintly frayed at the cuffs and shoulders, faded by repeated washing and the hard honesty of weather. His combat pants were worn too earth brown, with a mossy cast, knees scuffed, cargo pockets sagging slightly from constant use. Old military work boots, scratched and dependable. A battered field watch on his wrist, the kind that didn't care what year it was, as long as it still told the truth. If the village had a myth, Nate was the sort that didn't ask to be told. And if Nate had a guardian, it was a German shepherd named Sable. Sable was black and tan, built athletic, an adult 5 or 6 years old, neither puppy bright nor old man slow. His back was dark as wet bark. His chest and legs warmed with amber gold, and his eyes were a deep, steady brown that could turn sharp as a drawn bow when something felt wrong. His ears stood tall and honest. His movements were measured. He didn't bark at squirrels. He didn't waste noise on passing cars. When he ran, it was all purpose. When he rested, it was stillness with a listening edge. Around his neck, a simple black leather collar. No decorations, no slogans, nothing that said, "Look at me." What Sable said, he said with posture and silence. That morning, the two of them moved through the small rituals that made a life. Nate made coffee strong enough to frighten an optimist. Sable patrolled the porch, nose lifted, tasting the wind like it was a newspaper. Nate stepped outside, mug steaming in his hand, and watched the lake. It was calm, too calm glassy enough to show him a version of himself he didn't always like. Shoulders squared, even when nothing demanded it. Spine straight like a habit, eyes scanning the tree line without conscious thought. He'd learned that overseas. He didn't talk about it. Clearwater didn't ask. The town had the good sense to accept quiet the way it accepted snowfall, without interrogation. Sable leaned against Nate's leg for a moment, the heavy warmth of him grounding. Nate scratched behind his ear, and Sable let out a small exhale that sounded suspiciously like approval. "Yeah," Nate murmured, as if they were agreeing on the weather. "We're good." The village tried to keep itself simple. It had one diner that could cook eggs a dozen ways, but still somehow made them taste like home. It had a general store that sold everything from fishing hooks to birthday candles to gossip, and the gossip came free with purchase. Near midday, Nate drove into town for supplies: salt for the driveway, coffee filters, nails, the kind of mundane items that made a cabin less like a story and more like a place. Sable rode in the passenger seat like a co-pilot who didn't trust maps. The general store bell jingled as Nate stepped inside. The place smelled of cedar shelves, detergent, and old candy. Behind the counter stood Lorna Pike, a woman in her late 60s with a halo of iron-gray curls and eyes that missed nothing. She had a sturdy build, arms strong from decades of lifting boxes, and the kind of face that could soften into kindness or sharpen into a warning, depending on what you deserved. "Calloway," she greeted, not unkindly, "you look like you're planning to survive another week." "That's the goal," Nate said. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice was calm and low, like he'd made peace with volume a long time ago. Lorna leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as if the shelves had ears. "You hear the news?" Nate paused at the nails. "What news?" Lorna's mouth curled. "The kind that walks in wearing expensive boots and thinks mud is something you order off a menu." She nodded toward the window. Outside, two unfamiliar vehicles sat parked too neatly for Clearwater shiny SUVs, tinted glass. Not tourists. At the coffee aisle, two locals whispered with the theatrical subtlety of people who wanted to be overheard. One was Hank Sutter, a wiry fisherman with sun-cracked skin and a cap that looked older than some marriages. The other was Malin Ross, a school librarian with a gentle face and a spine of steel hidden under cardigans. "A big shot's coming," Hank said. "Wants lakefront." "Not just a cabin," Malin replied. "A whole estate." "A palace," Hank muttered. "Here." Sable's ears flicked toward them. His body didn't tense, but his gaze sharpened, the way a compass needle snaps to north. Nate felt it too. Not fear, not exactly. More like the first tug of a thread that might unravel a sweater. Lorna watched Nate's face closely. "They're saying development, like it's a blessing, like it won't bite." Nate set his nails down carefully. "Whose land?" Lorna's eyes didn't blink. "That's the trouble. Folks are already talking about lines on maps. They say some families are right in the middle of what he wants." Nate didn't answer. He didn't need to. In towns like Clearwater, land wasn't just property. It was inheritance. It was the place where a child learned to ride a bike, where an old man scattered a dog's ashes, where a woman planted lilacs because her mother planted lilacs. Outside, one of the SUVs rolled past the store at a slow crawl. Not lost, not curious. Sable watched it with the intensity of a lighthouse tracking fog. Nate paid, nodded once at Lorna, and left. The sun was bright, the sky an impossible blue, and yet the air felt subtly rearranged, like someone had moved furniture in a room and called it improvement. Back at the cabin, he unloaded supplies in silence. Sable paced the yard with a deliberate circuit, nose down, then up, then down again, reading the ground as if it were written in a language older than men. Nate repaired a loose porch board. He checked the generator. He stacked the salt by the door. Everything ordinary, except the feeling that ordinariness had just become something worth defending. The afternoon warmed enough that the lake began to smell alive. Nate sat on the porch steps with a wrench in hand, pretending the engine part in his lap needed more attention than it did. Across the water, loons called wild, haunting notes that always sounded like they were laughing at human plans. Sable settled beside him, head on his paws, gaze on the tree line. And then Sable did something strange. He rose without a sound and walked to the edge of the yard, toward a patch of dirt near the old birch. His tail didn't wag. His ears angled forward. He began to dig, not frantic, not playful, methodical, focused. "Nah," Nate muttered. "We're not doing that today." Sable didn't stop. Nate stood, crossed the yard, and watched as Sable unearthed something narrow and bright. It wasn't a bone. It wasn't trash. It was a thin, fresh-painted stake yellow-tipped wood, sharp at one end, the sort used for surveying, new enough to still smell like paint, clean enough to look out of place in Nate's rough yard, like a polished shoe in a barn. Sable nudged it toward Nate and stepped back, staring at him as if to say, "See?" For a moment, the world went quiet. Even the loons seemed to pause. Nate picked up the stake, turned it in his hand, saw faint pencil marks along one side numbers, a code. Not random, not accidental. His stomach tightened, a slow, steady coil, the kind of feeling he used to get when an alleyway had too few shadows, when a door was open that should have been closed. He looked down at Sable. The dog's eyes held his, steady and solemn. "Where'd you find this?" Nate asked, knowing the question was ridiculous and still needing to ask it anyway. Sable's ears twitched. He glanced toward the tree line, then back to Nate. It wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was something older than logic, an animal's certainty that danger had a scent. Nate stood there with the stake in his hand, feeling the air shift around him. Clearwater's brightness suddenly felt like a stage light. Beautiful, blinding, and unforgiving. He set the stake on the porch rail. He didn't break it. He didn't throw it away. He kept it where he could see it, like a warning note from the future left in the present. The sun dropped lower, turning the lake into molten gold. Shadows stretched long and slow. The wind chime spoke again, cheerful as a lyre. And then, from the gravel road beyond the trees, an engine sound drifted in, low, restrained, careful. Sable rose. Not with aggression, with intention. He moved to the porch edge and stared through the gaps in the pines. His body went still, every muscle quiet, like a bow drawn but not released. Nate stepped beside him and followed his gaze. A dark SUV crawled past the end of the driveway, slow enough to count porch posts, slow enough to memorize a man's habits. It didn't stop. It didn't need to. It just passed, like a finger tracing the outline of something it meant to take. Nate didn't wave. He didn't hide. He simply stood there in his worn olive gray shirt and scuffed boots, one hand resting lightly on Sable's collar. The dog didn't bark. He didn't need to. In the fading northern light, with the lake shining innocent and the forest holding its breath, man and dog watched the road as if it were the mouth of a story that had finally decided to open. And somewhere deep inside Nate, beneath discipline, beneath calm, beneath everything he'd tried to leave behind, something old and unyielding woke up. Not rage, clarity. Morning in Clearwater came bright and undecided, the kind of light that made everything look honest, even when it wasn't. Nate woke before the birds, the way he always did, and lay still long enough to listen. The cabin held its usual sounds, the faint tick of cooling wood, the wind brushing the eaves, Sable's slow, steady breathing at the foot of the bed. Nothing out of place. Nothing shouting danger. Still, Nate didn't rush. He moved quietly through the kitchen, brewed coffee, and stood at the window with the mug warming his hands. The lake beyond the trees was pale and smooth, a clean page waiting for ink. He'd learned long ago that calm was often just the pause before intention showed itself. Sable rose when Nate did. The dog stretched front legs long, back arching, and padded to the door with a soft huff. Outside, he made his slow circuit of the yard, nose low, tail neutral, attention distributed evenly like a professional habit. He returned and sat at Nate's side without prompting. "Looks like a meeting day," Nate said, more to the room than to the dog. The bell at the Clearwater Community Hall rang at 10. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound carried because people were already listening. The hall stood a few blocks from the lake, a long, narrow building with clapboard siding and windows that rattled when the wind cut across the open field. Inside, folding chairs formed uneven rows. The place smelled of old paper, lemon cleaner, and the faint sweetness of coffee that had been reheated one time too many. Nate arrived early. He took a seat near the back, where he could see the doors and the faces at once. Sable lay at his feet, alert but relaxed, ears angled like antennae tuned to a frequency only he could hear. People filtered in with the unspoken choreography of a small town. Neighbors nodded, couples sat together out of habit, arguments paused out of courtesy. There was tension, but it hadn't found a shape yet. At the front of the room stood Eli Turner. Eli was in his early 70s, tall and spare, with a stoop earned by years leaning over drafting tables and river maps. His hair was white and thin, combed carefully to one side. His hands bore faint ink stains that never quite washed out, the mark of a man who had once drawn lines that decided where roads would go and where they would not. He wore a tweed jacket that had seen better winters and a tie knotted with quiet pride. Eli cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice dry but steady. "I'll get to it." He laid out a set of rolled papers on the table and flattened them with care. "Maps." not the kind tourists bought. These were technical, layered with markings that meant nothing to outsiders and everything to people who knew how to read them. There's interest, Eli continued, choosing his words like a man who understood how easily they could be misused. From outside, significant interest. Murmurs rippled. They're calling it development, Eli said. Eco-forward, high-end, promises of jobs, upgrades, and, he paused, access. That word landed heavy. A woman in the second row raised her hand. Access to what? She asked. Her name was Clara Wynne, a potter with clay under her nails and lines at the corners of her eyes that came from smiling at her own work. She was compact, sturdy, the kind of person who made things meant to be held. Eli met her gaze. To the lake, he said, on their terms. He pointed to a narrow band on the map, a strip of land hugging the water. Several parcels were circled. Names followed. Some belonged to families who had lived here for generations. One belonged to Nathan Calloway. Nate felt the room tilt, not dramatically, just enough to register. He didn't look down. He didn't need to. A man stood near the door, hands in the pockets of an expensive coat. He hadn't sat. He hadn't spoken. He had arrived with the confidence of someone accustomed to rooms making space for him. Lucas Grant. Lucas was in his early 40s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with a posture that suggested long flights and longer negotiations. His hair was neatly parted, not a strand out of place, and his face carried a practiced openness, friendly enough to invite trust, distant enough to deny obligation. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a white shirt, no tie, the uniform of a man who wanted to appear flexible while remaining in control. He stepped forward now, smile ready. I'm glad to see such turnout, he said. His voice was smooth, warm, as if he were hosting a dinner rather than announcing a plan that would rearrange lives. I represent Northline Development. We're here because we believe Clearwater deserves investment. Investment, another word with weight. Lucas gestured toward the maps. This area is special. We don't want to change that. We want to enhance it. Nate watched Lucas the way he watched water after a storm, looking not at the surface, but at what the current pulled beneath. Lucas continued. No one will be forced. Conversations will be respectful. Offers will be generous. Hank Sutter laughed, short and sharp. They always are, he said, at first. Lucas smiled, as if Hank had complimented him. We understand concerns, he said. That's why we want to work with community representatives. His eyes found Nate, held him there, just long enough to be deliberate. Nate didn't react. He didn't nod. He didn't look away. He simply met the gaze, expression unchanged. Sable shifted at Nate's feet, not rising, just repositioning so his shoulder brushed Nate's boot. The contact was light, intentional, grounding. A few people turned to look, not at Lucas, at Nate. The room felt different now, focused, as if an unspoken vote had begun without ballots. Eli cleared his throat again. We'll need to consider legal counsel, he said. And representation. Clara spoke without raising her hand this time. We already have someone, she said, glancing back. Heads turned. Nate felt the attention settle, not heavy, not urgent, expectant. He stood slowly. I'm not a lawyer, he said. I don't want to be anyone's hero. A few smiles flickered. But I'll ask questions, Nate continued. I'll make sure no one signs something they don't understand. And if we need to push back, I won't step aside. Lucas's smile thinned by a degree, not enough to be rude, Enough to be real. That's all anyone's asking, Clara said. The meeting moved on to logistics committees, timelines, who would gather records, who would speak to whom. Nate listened. He took notes. He marked names and dates and promises. He didn't argue. He didn't commit beyond what he had said. When the chairs folded and people drifted out into the sun, Lucas approached Nate with an easy stride. "Mr. Calloway," he said, offering a hand. Nate looked at it for a half-second too long, then shook. The grip was firm, practiced. Not a challenge, a test. "I respect your service," Lucas said. "Men like you understand sacrifice." Nate's mouth curved slightly, not a smile. "I understand choices," he said. Lucas nodded, as if that satisfied him. "We'll be in touch." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the hall windows. Clouds gathered to the west, tall and white, moving faster than the forecast had promised. Nate walked home along the long way, cutting by the water. Sable trotted beside him, head level, eyes scanning the reeds and rocks. About a third of the way along the path, Sable stopped. Not abruptly, not alarmed. He simply halted and stared across the lake. Nate followed his gaze. On the far shore, a lone heron stood motionless at the edge of the water, its reflection perfectly aligned beneath it. The bird didn't move, didn't hunt, didn't flee. A hush fell over the lake. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Sable sat. The moment stretched long enough to feel intentional, short enough to feel chosen. Then the heron lifted, wings wide, and vanished into the trees. Sable exhaled and rose, continuing on as if nothing had happened. Nate felt a strange calm settle over him, threaded with something older than reason. He'd seen moments like that before, pauses that didn't warn so much as confirm. They reached the cabin as the first drops of rain fell, light and scattered. Nate set his notebook on the table, weighed down by the old survey stake he'd kept. He watched the rain trace lines down the window, each drop finding its own path, none asking permission. Sable lay by the door, ears twitching as the storm grew. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant. Nate sipped his coffee, now cold, and thought of maps and lines and words, like investment and access. He thought of Lucas's eyes and the way they measured space. He thought of the village hall, filled with people who didn't want to be brave, but might have to be. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. The lake returned to glass. That evening, as the light faded, a car idled on the road longer than it needed to. Nate didn't go to the porch. He didn't wave. Sable lifted his head and watched until the sound disappeared. Neither of them slept early that night. Clearwater changed its posture before it changed its behavior. The days after the meeting were bright and ordinary on the surface. The lake kept its shine. The roads stayed quiet. People still waved. But Nate felt it the way he felt weather before storms, pressure without sound. A tightening that didn't announce itself. He worked anyway. Mornings began with the same routine: coffee, the porch, a scan of the tree line. Sable stayed close, moving with a careful patience that mirrored Nate's own. The dog's black and tan coat caught the light in clean lines. His eyes were steady, watchful, neither anxious nor relaxed. He had learned this place quickly. He had also learned when it was being watched. On the third morning after the meeting, the first letter arrived. It wasn't delivered by mail. It lay on the porch rail when Nate came back from stacking firewood, an envelope, thick, unmarked, clean enough to look deliberate. He didn't touch it right away. He let Sable sniff it first. The dog leaned forward, nose hovering. He didn't flinch. He didn't back away. He simply turned his head aside, a small rejection. Nate opened the envelope with a thumbnail. Inside was a single sheet, printed impersonal. We believe in cooperative outcomes. Please consider the enclosed offer. No signature, no phone number, just a figure printed at the bottom large enough to make a reasonable man hesitate. Nate folded the paper once and set it aside. He didn't tear it. He didn't burn it. He understood what it was meant to do. Establish a tone. That afternoon, a pair of men arrived in Clearwater wearing reflective vests and polite smiles. They introduced themselves as surveyors. One was tall and narrow, with a thin mustache that tried to soften his mouth and failed. The other was shorter, broad-shouldered, his hair cropped close, jaw stubbled like he hadn't bothered to shave in a few days. Both wore boots too clean for the work they claimed to do. They spoke to people at the edge of town first, then worked their way closer to the lake. By the time they reached Nate's property line, he was already there. He stood with his hands in his pockets, posture relaxed enough to look careless. Sable sat at his heel, ears forward. "We're just taking measurements," the taller man said, gesturing with a clipboard. His voice carried the lightness of someone trained to disarm with tone. "Nothing permanent." Nate nodded once. "You don't have permission." The shorter man shifted his weight. "We're within our rights." "No," Nate said. Not louder, just final. The tall man smiled, the kind that tried to pretend at patience. "Sir, there's a larger plan here." Nate didn't move. "Take your measurements somewhere else." There was a pause. The kind that tested boundaries. Sable didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood, body aligned with Nate's leg, eyes fixed on the shorter man. The look wasn't hostile. It was declarative. The shorter man cleared his throat. "We'll be back." "I doubt it," Nate said. They left without argument. The gravel crackled under their boots, louder than it needed to be. That evening, Nate drove into town to speak with Eli Turner. Eli's house sat back from the road, modest and orderly, a place where bookshelves pressed close to windows and lamps were positioned for reading, not ambiance. Eli answered the door in a sweater vest and pressed slacks, his white hair neatly combed, his eyes alert behind thin-framed glasses. "I saw the letters," Eli said after Nate explained. "Others too. Different amounts. Same language." He poured coffee with a careful hand. "They're testing resolve and reaction time." "They brought surveyors," Nate said. Eli's mouth tightened. "Then they're moving faster than they want us to think." He leaned back, hands folded. "I've read their filings. They're clean on the surface. No violations yet. That's deliberate." "Yet," Nate echoed. Eli nodded. "Pressure comes before paperwork." Outside, Sable paced the yard, stopping occasionally to stare into the dark. When a car passed on the road, he watched it go, not tracking, not tense, just counting. The next day, Clearwater's general store became quieter. People still came and went, but conversations cut off mid-sentence when the bell rang. Lorna Pike watched the room with narrowed eyes, her iron gray curls pulled back tighter than usual. They've been asking questions, she said to Nate as she rang him up. Not about land, about you. Nate raised an eyebrow. Where you came from, why you left the service, if you've had trouble before. She snorted, as if a man needs a reason to mind his own business. Sable lay near the door, chin on paws, eyes open. A young boy tried to pet him. Sable allowed it, shifting only enough to keep his flank between the child and the street. That night, a truck idled near Nate's drive long enough to be noticed, long enough to be counted. Nate didn't confront it. He turned off the porch light and waited. The truck left. On the fourth morning, Sable refused to eat. He stood by his bowl, sniffed, and stepped back. His ears flattened slightly, not fear, but uncertainty. Nate crouched, inspected the food. It smelled normal, looked normal. Sable turned away and sat, eyes on the window. Nate discarded the food and cleaned the bowl. He prepared another portion from a sealed container. Sable ate this time, but slowly, pausing between bites as if listening for something beyond sound. Nate made a note. Later that day, he walked the perimeter of the property with Sable at his side. Near the far fence line, the dog stopped again. He lowered his head and sniffed the ground in tight circles. Nate saw it then. A small piece of meat half buried near the fence. Fresh. Too fresh to be animal discard. He didn't touch it. He photographed it, marked the spot, and removed it with gloves. Sable watched, tail still. That was when the world narrowed, not with panic, with focus. That evening, as dusk pressed the lake into a mirror of darkening gold, Sable did something Nate had never seen him do. The dog rose from his place on the porch and walked slowly, deliberately toward the far end of the yard. He stopped at the fence, lifted his head, and let out a single, low sound. Not a bark, not a growl, a note. It carried just far enough to reach the trees. Then he sat. Nate felt it in his chest, a resonance that didn't belong to sound. He didn't know who or what the signal was meant for, only that it had been sent. The response came the next morning. A man waited by the road when Nate drove out for supplies. He leaned against a pickup truck with no plates on the front, arms crossed, posture casual in the way of someone trying to look harmless. He introduced himself as Aaron Pike, no relation to Lorna. Late 30s, broad face, red beard trimmed short, eyes tired, not cruel. "I'm not here to threaten you," Aaron said quickly. "I'm here to warn you." Nate listened. "They're paying people," Aaron continued, "for information, for access, for mistakes." "Who's they?" Nate asked. Aaron hesitated. "I don't know names. I know roots." Sable stood between them, silent. Aaron swallowed. "They're not done testing you." Nate thanked him. Aaron left. The day passed under a bright sky that felt increasingly artificial. By evening, Clearwater's lake reflected stars sharp enough to cut. Nate sat at the table with his notebook open. He wrote down times, vehicles, names. He kept his pen steady. Sable lay nearby, eyes half closed, ears turning at every distant sound. The pressure wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, yet, but it was deliberate, and it was patient. Clearwater did not wake to sirens. It woke to birdsong, pale sunlight, and the illusion that nothing had shifted overnight. Nate noticed the lie immediately. The morning air felt thinner, as if something essential had been removed without permission. He stood on the porch with his coffee, watching the lake hold its shape too perfectly. Sable sat beside him, upright, still, his ears angled not toward the forest this time, but toward the road. "Yeah," Nate murmured. "I feel it too." They drove into town just after 9. The sheriff's station sat behind the old firehouse, a squat brick building with narrow windows and a flag that snapped sharply in the breeze. It wasn't intimidating by design. It didn't need to be. In a place like Clearwater, authority worked best when it looked familiar. Sable stayed in the truck. He did not whine. He did not resist. He watched Nate through the windshield with the patient seriousness of a dog who understood boundaries, even when he didn't agree with them. Inside, the station smelled of disinfectant and old paper. A radio crackled softly somewhere behind the front desk. A man looked up from a computer and nodded without smiling. "Morning," he said. "What can I do for you?" "I need to report harassment," Nate replied, "and suspected illegal surveying." The man hesitated. "You'll want to speak to Deputy Kessler." Wade Kessler emerged from the back hallway as if summoned by the sound of his own name. He was in his late 40s, built thick through the middle, his uniform pressed clean enough to look performative. His hair was cut short and thinning at the temples. His face carried the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned how not to react too much, or at all. "Mr. Calloway," Kessler said, voice even, "we've heard about you." Nate didn't respond to that. He laid out the facts carefully. The letters, the surveyors, the meat found near his fence. He kept his tone level, his language precise. No speculation, no accusation, just a record. Kessler listened with his head tilted slightly, hands resting on his belt. When Nate finished, the deputy nodded slowly. "Sounds like a misunderstanding," he said. "Developers send letters, surveyors do their jobs. As for the food, could have been an animal." Nate held his gaze. It was placed. Kessler's mouth twitched. "You can't prove intent." Nate reached into his pocket and placed his phone on the counter. He slid it forward, showing the photographs, the timestamp, the location. Kessler glanced at the screen, then looked away. "You're on edge," he said mildly. "That happens when people get protective of their property." "What happens when someone gets protective of their dog?" Nate asked. Kessler finally looked back at him. His eyes were pale, almost colorless. "That depends." The word hung there. "Dogs that attack people," Kessler continued, "become a problem. Even good ones, even trained ones." Sable's ears twitched in the truck outside. Nate felt something cold move through him. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. "Are you threatening me?" Nate asked. Kessler smiled. "Just barely. I'm advising you. These situations can escalate. Accidents happen. And when they do, the law has to respond. Only if it's pointed in the right direction," Nate said. Kessler straightened. "Careful." Nate collected his phone. "File the report." Kessler shook his head. "There's nothing to file." Nate stood there for a long moment, memorizing the man's face. Not out of spite, out of habit. Outside, Sable rose as Nate approached the truck. He did not bark. He did not wag. He simply watched Nate's hands, his posture, the line of his shoulders. Nate rested a palm briefly against the dog's neck before opening the door. They drove back toward the lake in silence. By noon, word had spread. Not the truth. Not exactly. Something adjacent to it. A distortion. At the general store, conversations shifted when Nate walked in. Some faces softened in sympathy. Others hardened in uncertainty. Lorna Pike leaned over the counter. They were asking about Sable, she said quietly. If he's aggressive. Nate exhaled slowly. And? And I told them I've never seen him bare his teeth at anyone who didn't deserve it. That earned a flicker of a smile. Outside the store, a woman waited near a blue sedan. She was in her early 40s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with ash blonde hair pulled back in a loose knot that suggested she didn't bother much with mirrors. Her skin was fair, lightly weathered, the kind that had known both winters and hard decisions. She wore jeans, boots, and a dark jacket too thin for the breeze. She introduced herself as Sarah Lowell. I work with the county zoning board, she said. Or I did. I'm on leave. Her voice was calm, but her eyes moved constantly. Windows, doors, passing cars. They came to me first, she continued, asked me to reinterpret some setback requirements. I said no. What happened? Nate asked. They stopped asking. She hesitated. Then they started leaning. Nate listened. Sarah explained in clipped sentences how files went missing, how her supervisor suggested she take time, how a private number called late at night, breathing on the line. I don't scare easily, she said, but I scare accurately. Sable stood between them, gaze fixed on Sarah. After a moment, he stepped forward and sat. Sarah looked down at him. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. He trusts you, she said to Nate. That means something. It means he's paying attention, Nate replied. Sarah nodded. So am I. They spoke for a few more minutes, about maps, permits, pressure points. Then Sarah left, walking with her head high and her pace steady, as if daring anyone to follow. That afternoon, the vet called. Dr. Margaret Hale's voice came through the phone firm, but careful. Sable's fine, she said, but someone called the clinic this morning. Asked questions about his temperament, his history. Nate closed his eyes. What did you tell them? The truth, she said, and I documented the call. Good, Nate thought. At least someone still was. Just before dusk, Sable began to shake. Not tremble shake, hard enough to rattle his collar. Nate knelt beside him immediately, hands moving over the dog's frame, checking for injury. There was none. Sable wasn't cold. He wasn't hurt. His eyes were locked on the tree line. Then Nate smelled it. Smoke. Not close. Not threatening. But deliberate. A thin plume rose beyond the ridge, where the forest thickened and the land dropped toward the water. Too controlled to be lightning. Too small to be a wildfire. A signal. Sable stopped shaking and sat, body rigid, waiting. The fire burned out by nightfall. No one claimed it. No one investigated. By the next morning, the smoke had become another unspoken thing Clearwater learned not to mention. Nate did not forget. He spent the day documenting. He walked the property lines, took photographs, logged vehicle movements. He wrote down names, times, patterns. The pressure was no longer subtle. A second letter arrived. This one less polite. Opportunities do not wait. Nate fed it to the stove and watched it burn. That night, the road carried more traffic than usual. Cars slowed, engines idled. Someone laughed too loudly in the dark. Sable paced the porch, restless but controlled. Easy, Nate said. We don't give them what they want. Sable obeyed. Barely. The dog lay down at Nate's feet, eyes open, ears turning, absorbing every sound. Nate sat at the table, writing until his hand cramped. He thought of Kessler's eyes, Sarah's voice, the fire on the ridge. He understood now. This wasn't about land. It was about forcing a mistake. And they were running out of ways to make him feel small. The first real wound came quietly. Not with shouting. Not with sirens. It came the way cowards preferred. Out of sight, timed carefully, designed to look like an accident or a misunderstanding. The day began like any other in Clearwater, bright and almost gentle. Nate spent the morning repairing a neighbor's dock plank, the wood swollen from spring melt. He worked with steady movements, listening more than he spoke. Sable stayed nearby, lying on the grass where he could see both the water and the road. His body relaxed, but his eyes always open. People were watching Nate more openly now. Not hostile. Not supportive either. Curious. Measuring. As if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of man pressure would carve out of him. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in low and heavy, turning the lake the color of dull steel. Nate finished his work and headed home, Sable trotting beside him, tail level, ears flicking at distant sounds. That was when Sable slowed. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't alarmed. It was cautious, the way he moved when something didn't match the pattern he expected. Nate noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Sable didn't look at him. His nose lowered toward the ground near the edge of the trail, where the grass met the brush. He sniffed once, then again. His body stiffened. Not fear, not aggression. Recognition. Nate followed his gaze. Someone had been there. Footprints, shallow but fresh, pressed into the damp soil. Too neat for hikers, too deliberate for children, and leading just far enough into the trees to suggest direction without certainty. Sable took one step forward. "No," Nate said softly. The dog stopped. He turned his head back toward Nate, eyes searching his face, not disobedient, but conflicted. His instincts were pulling one way. His training, another. Nate crouched, placed a hand against Sable's chest, feeling the steady thump beneath the fur. "We don't chase," he murmured. "We observe." Sable held still for a long moment. Then he exhaled and stepped back, pressing his shoulder briefly against Nate's knee as if sealing the decision. They went home. Night came early under the clouds. Nate cooked a simple dinner, the radio murmuring low in the background. Sable ate without hesitation, then settled near the door, his body angled toward the porch as if listening through wood and glass. The wind picked up after dark, rattling branches against one another. Somewhere across the lake, a motor started, then stopped. Nate didn't bother looking. He knew better than to react to every noise. It was close to midnight when Sable rose. This time, there was no hesitation. He went to the door and stood there, motionless, ears high, tail rigid. His body wasn't tense. It was ready. Nate reached for his jacket. "I hear it," he said, though he didn't. Not yet. He opened the door just enough to step onto the porch. The air smelled wrong, metallic, sweet, sharp, blood. Nate's eyes dropped immediately. Sable took one step forward and staggered. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but Nate caught it. His heart slammed hard enough to steal his breath. Sable. The dog tried to straighten. His back legs held, but his front paw faltered. A dark smear marked the boards beneath him, nearly black in the low light. Nate was at his side in an instant. He knelt, hands moving with trained precision, checking shoulders, ribs, legs. Sable's breathing was shallow, fast, controlled through pain. His eyes stayed locked on Nate's face, unblinking. "It's okay," Nate said, though nothing about this was. "I've got you." He found the wound along Sable's side, a deep gash hidden beneath the thick fur, edges torn, not clean, not an accident, not a fall. Someone had reached him. Nate felt something inside his chest break, not explode, not burn, break cleanly, like a bone under too much weight. "Stay with me," he whispered. Sable let out a soft sound, not a whine, a reassurance. Nate lifted him carefully. Sable was heavy, solid, his weight familiar and grounding even as it pulled painfully at Nate's arms. Blood soaked into Nate's shirt, dark and warm. He didn't lock the door. He didn't turn off the lights. He carried Sable to the truck and drove. The veterinary clinic sat on the edge of the county line, a low building with a single light glowing in the rain. Nate skidded to a stop and burst through the door. "Help!" he called. Dr. Margaret Hale appeared instantly. She was in her early 50s, tall and angular, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical knot. Her face was lined not with softness, but with focus, the look of someone who had seen too much suffering to waste time on panic. She took one look at Sable and swore under her breath. "Table," she said, "now." Nate laid Sable down gently. The dog didn't resist, didn't cry. His eyes followed Nate's every movement, steady even as pain trembled through his frame. "What happened?" Hale asked, already gloved. "He was attacked," Nate said. His voice was level, too level. Hale nodded. "I see it." She worked quickly, hands firm and precise. Sable flinched once, then stilled, trusting. Nate stood close enough to feel the heat of the lights. His fists clenched until his knuckles whitened. "He's strong," Hale said after a moment. "But whoever did this knew where to cut." Nate swallowed. "Is he going to live?" Hale met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "because he wants to." The words hit harder than comfort ever could. Sable was taken into surgery. The door closed. Nate sat alone in the waiting room, elbows on knees, hands shaking now that there was nothing left to do. Rain streaked the windows. Somewhere, a clock ticked too loudly. That was when Nate noticed the camera. A small, dusty security camera mounted above the clinic entrance. Its red light blinking steadily. Recording. Nate stood slowly and looked up at the lens. For the first time since he'd found Sable bleeding on the porch, something like clarity cut through the pain. Someone had made a mistake. Hale emerged nearly an hour later, wiping her hands on a towel. "He's stable," she said. "Sedated. He'll need time." Nate exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. "I need a statement," he said. Hale studied him. "I already wrote one." She handed him a clipboard. Detailed notes. Time of injury. Nature of wound. Clear language. "This wasn't an animal," she said quietly. "And it wasn't self-inflicted." "Thank you," Nate said. Hale's mouth tightened. "Be careful," she added. "Men who hurt dogs don't stop there." Nate nodded. He already knew. He returned home alone. The cabin felt wrong without Sable's weight in it. Too empty. Too exposed. Nate walked the perimeter with a flashlight, slower this time. He found disturbed soil near the trees. Broken twigs. A smear of blood where Sable must have fought his way back. Near the fence, he found a length of wire. Thin. twisted, crude, a tool. Nate bagged it carefully. He didn't sleep. By morning, word had spread, but twisted. Someone had been telling people Sable attacked first, that Nate had lost control of his dog, that an incident had occurred. Nate drove straight to the sheriff's station. Kessler listened with the same neutral face as before. When Nate finished, the deputy folded his arms. "Dangerous animal," he said calmly. "This complicates things." "He was assaulted," Nate said. "I have a veterinary report." Kessler shrugged. "Dogs don't get the benefit of the doubt." Nate leaned forward. "People do." Kessler's eyes hardened. "Watch yourself." Nate stood. "You already are." That afternoon, Sarah Lowell came to the cabin. She looked pale, her ash blonde hair pulled tight, her eyes sharp with urgency. "They crossed a line," she said. "Hurt your dog." Nate nodded once. "I've been gathering files," Sarah continued. "Permits, emails, patterns. I was waiting. I'm not anymore." She glanced toward the empty porch. "Where is he?" "At the vet." Her jaw clenched. "Good." They stood in silence for a moment, the lake quiet behind them. "They think this will break you," Sarah said. "Make you choose." Nate's gaze drifted to the dark stain, still visible on the porch boards. "They already chose wrong," he replied. That night, Nate returned to the clinic and sat beside Sable's kennel. The dog's eyes opened when Nate spoke his name. His tail thumped once, weak but deliberate. Nate rested his hand against the bars. "You did good," he whispered. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." Sable's breathing steadied. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Inside Nate, something settled into place. Not vengeance. Not rage. Resolve. Clearwater learned how to whisper. After the night Sable was attacked, voices lowered. Doors closed more carefully. Trucks passed slower than they needed to. The village didn't erupt into outrage. It folded inward, quiet and watchful, like a field before frost. Nate welcomed the silence. It gave him room to think. He spent the first morning at the clinic, sitting beside Sable's kennel, while the dog slept under medication. The shepherd looked smaller lying down, his powerful frame softened by bandages and fatigue. His breathing was steady now, deeper than the night before. When Nate spoke his name, Sable's ear twitched, and his tail tapped once against the metal tray, deliberate, restrained, alive. Dr. Margaret Hale checked the monitors with the same economy she brought to everything. She stood tall, shoulders squared, gray hair pulled back in a knot that didn't move when she did. Her eyes, sharp, unsentimental, met Nate's briefly. "He's going to heal," she said, physically. Nate nodded. He understood what she didn't say. Outside, the sky was clean and cold. The lake glittered as if nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. Nate drove home alone, the truck too quiet without the familiar weight in the passenger seat. At the cabin, he laid out everything he had: letters, photos, times, names. The twisted wire bagged and labeled Dr. Hale's report. The second letter, less polite than the first, its language edged with impatience. He taped timelines to the wall with painter's tape, stepping back to see how events aligned. Pressure, probe, threat, violence. It was a pattern, and patterns were breakable. Sarah Lowell arrived before noon. She parked a half-mile down the road and walked the rest of the way, hands in her jacket pockets, eyes scanning the trees as if she expected them to speak. She was tall and lean, ash blonde hair pulled tight today, jaw set with resolve. The wind had reddened her cheeks. It had not softened her. "I brought what I have," she said, setting a slim laptop on the table. She explained while the screen woke. Files had been altered, emails forwarded through private addresses, zoning notes that had vanished and reappeared with different timestamps. The kind of mistakes people made when they thought no one would notice. "They're sloppy when they're comfortable," Sarah said. "They didn't think I'd copy everything before I took leave." Nate listened, asking questions only when necessary. He took notes by hand. "They want you isolated," Sarah continued. "If they make this about your dog, they make you emotional. If you react, they win." Nate looked at the dark stain still visible on the porch boards. "Then we don't react." He made calls that afternoon, quiet ones. He didn't ask for favors. He asked for truth. Eli Turner arrived after lunch with a stack of old maps and a thermos of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in another decade. The old planner's hands shook slightly as he laid the papers out, but his mind was razor sharp. "They changed the setback language last year," Eli said, tapping a line with his finger. "Buried it under environmental mitigation. Legal if you don't look too close. And if you do?" Nate asked. Eli smiled thinly. "Then you notice how many parcels they need to control sightlines. Yours is one." The general store door jingled late in the afternoon. Lorna Pike stepped in, her curls pulled back with a clip that meant she was all business. She didn't sit. "They're paying cash," she said. "Not here. In the next county over, asking for photos, schedules, when you're home, when you're not." Nate wrote it down. That evening, Aaron Pike returned. He looked worse than before, eyes rimmed red, beard grown uneven, shoulders hunched, as if he expected to be struck. He wouldn't come inside. He stood at the edge of the porch light, rain speckling his jacket. "I saw the man who hurt your dog," he said. "Didn't know it then, know it now." Nate waited. "He works security sometimes," Aaron continued. "Private, off the books. I heard his voice when they were talking about you. About how dogs can be handled." Nate felt his jaw tighten. "Name?" Aaron shook his head. "I don't have it, but I have his truck." He described it in detail. Color, damage, stickers. Nate noted everything. When Aaron left, Nate sat alone and watched the lake darken. This was no longer about standing his ground. It was about building a case strong enough to stand without him. By the second day, the town began to shift. Not loudly, subtly. People stopped repeating the rumors. They asked questions instead. The librarian printed copies of public records. A mechanic down the road installed a camera facing the bend without telling anyone why. The diner owner started writing down license plates on a notepad she kept beneath the register. Clearwater didn't choose sides with signs and slogans. It chose with habits. Sarah returned with more files. Emails tied to shell companies. Payments routed through consulting firms that existed only on paper. She worked late into the night at the cabin table, the glow of her screen reflected in the dark window. Nate brewed coffee and said little. He watched her shoulders tense and release as patterns emerged. "They're connected," she said finally. "The developer, the surveyors, a law firm 2 counties south." "And Kessler?" Nate asked. Sarah hesitated. "I can't prove it. Not yet." Nate nodded. "We'll let him prove it himself." Near midnight, the printer jammed. Sarah cursed softly and pulled the tray open. A folded page slid out, one she hadn't sent to print. It was an internal memo, header stripped, date obscured, but the language was unmistakable. "If Callaway refuses, escalate through animal control statutes. Create record of instability. Proceed quietly. Sarah looked up at Nate, color draining from her face. They wrote this, she said, before the attack. Nate read the page once, then again. Somewhere deep inside him, the last doubt fell away. They worked until dawn. Nate drove the packet to a secure location Sarah trusted, then made a second copy and hid it where only he would look. He didn't trust clouds. He trusted weight and distance. At the clinic, Sable woke when Nate arrived. The dog's eyes were clearer now, though pain lingered in the way his ears flattened at sudden sounds. When Nate knelt, Sable leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against Nate's chest through the kennel bars. The contact was brief, controlled, enough. I know, Nate whispered. We're not done. Dr. Hale watched from the doorway. He'll need a few days, she said. And after that, restrictions. Nate nodded. He'll have them. On the way out, Nate noticed another camera. Older, angled toward the parking lot. He stopped, memorizing its position. The sheriff's cruiser passed him on the road. Kessler didn't slow, didn't look. That was fine. Nate spent the afternoon preparing statements. He wrote clearly, without embellishment. He included dates, times, witnesses. He practiced saying nothing that couldn't be proven. At sunset, Sarah left. Exhaustion etched into her posture, but resolve holding her upright. They'll push back, she said, harder. Good, Nate replied. That means we're close. The night was quiet again. Too quiet to be accidental. Nate sat on the porch, with the lights off, listening to the water move against the rocks. Without Sable there, the space felt incomplete, but it also sharpened his attention. A vehicle idled briefly on the road and moved on. Nate didn't move. Inside, the files lay stacked and ready. Outside, Clearwater held its breath. They wanted him tired, alone, afraid of losing what mattered most. They didn't understand the mistake they'd made. By touching the dog, they hadn't weakened him. They'd given him witnesses. And witnesses, Nate knew, had a way of turning pressure into truth. The courthouse in Clearwater was smaller than most people expected. No marble columns. No grand steps. Just a low stone building with a flag that snapped too hard in the wind and doors that creaked when they opened, as if reminding everyone that justice here was meant to be walked into, not admired from a distance. Nate arrived early. He wore the same clothes he always did. The faded olive gray combat shirt, the worn field pants, the old boots that knew the shape of his feet better than any floor ever would. He had not shaved differently, had not tried to look softer or sharper. He had learned long ago that courts, like storms, respected what didn't pretend. Sable was not with him. The absence sat heavy, like a missing limb. Nate felt it in the way his hand kept drifting toward an empty space at his side. The dog was still recovering at the clinic, under observation, his movement restricted. Dr. Hale had been firm about that. Nate had agreed. This fight did not need Sable's body. It already had his truth. Inside the courtroom, the air smelled faintly of old wood and paper that had been handled by nervous hands. Rows of benches filled slowly locals first, then people who didn't belong to Clearwater but had business pretending they did. Lucas Grant sat at the defense table, immaculate as ever. His charcoal suit was perfectly pressed, his hair neat, his posture relaxed. He looked like a man who had never waited for anything he couldn't buy. Beside him sat two lawyers, both men in their 40s, clean-cut, sharp-eyed. One leaned back too comfortably. The other never stopped writing. Deputy Wade Kessler entered through the side door. He looked smaller in here, without the badge catching light at his chest, without the station walls to prop him up. He appeared like what he was, a thick-set man with tired eyes and a jaw that clenched too often. His uniform was clean, but the creases seemed less confident. Sarah Lowell arrived quietly and took a seat behind Nate. She looked pale but steady, ash blonde hair pulled back tight, hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. She nodded once at Nate. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. Dr. Margaret Hale entered last. She wore a dark blazer over her clinic clothes, her posture straight, her steel gray hair pinned back with the same no-nonsense precision she brought to every surgery. She carried a folder, thick with records, and the expression of someone who did not enjoy conflict, but refused to step away from it. The judge entered. Judge Harold Whitmore was in his early 60s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved by long years of restraint. His hair was silver, his eyes deep-set and observant. He had the look of a man who had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that silence was often more revealing than testimony. He took his seat and looked out over the room. "Let's begin," he said. The case unfolded the way truth often did not in a rush, but in layers. First came the land. Maps were presented. Timelines established. Eli Turner testified, his thin frame stiff, but his voice clear as he explained zoning manipulations, altered language, and strategic pressure points designed to force landowners into selling. He spoke without drama, and the room leaned in to listen. Sarah followed. She described missing files, late-night calls, suggestions made just carefully enough to deny intent. She did not embellish. She did not speculate. She simply explained what she had seen, what she had refused to do, and what had happened after. Then came the money. Paper trails were shown. Consulting fees routed through shell entities. Payments that lined up too neatly with moments of pressure. The lawyers objected. The judge overruled. Lucas Grant maintained his composure, but Nate noticed the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once against the table and then stopped. Deputy Kessler was called next. He answered questions politely at first, calmly, confidently. But confidence frayed. The internal memo was introduced. Kessler's eyes flicked to it, just once, but it was enough. The language was read aloud, slowly, clearly. Escalate through animal control statutes. Create record of instability. The courtroom shifted. Kessler's lawyer objected. The judge allowed the question to stand. Dr. Hale testified after. She described Sable's injuries with clinical precision. The depth of the wound, the angle, the force required. She explained how the injury could not have been caused by a fall, nor by another animal. "Someone attacked this dog," she said, deliberately. Her voice did not waver. The defense attempted to pivot. They spoke of risk, of responsibility, of how dangerous animals could become when improperly controlled. They introduced the idea that Sable had attacked first, that Nate had lost control. Judge Whitmore raised a hand. "Bring the animal control report," he said. The report was thin, almost embarrassingly so. Then came the footage. Not from the clinic camera this time. that had already been entered. This footage came from a roadside camera installed by a mechanic near the bend, one the defense had not known about. It showed a truck, matching Aaron Pike's description, slowing near Nate's property late at night. A figure exiting, moving toward the tree line, moving back. No faces, no heroics, just timing. The defense sat down. The judge looked at Nate. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "you may speak." Nate stood. He did not bring notes. He did not pace. He placed his hands flat on the table and spoke the way he always did. Quiet, deliberate, without waste. "I'm not here because of land," Nate said, "and I'm not here because of money." He paused. The room stayed with him. "I live in Clearwater because it's honest. People here don't want much. They want to stay, that's all." He swallowed once. "My dog was attacked because someone thought hurting him would break me, that it would force me to choose between protecting my neighbors and protecting my family." The word landed. Family. Sable's name was not spoken. He didn't need to be. "I trained that dog," Nate continued. "Not to attack. To protect, to listen, to stop when told. He has lived with children, with strangers, with men who raised their voices and men who didn't. He has never hurt anyone." Nate lifted his eyes to the judge. He was hurt because he didn't do what they wanted. And if the law decides that makes him disposable, then the law isn't protecting the public. It's protecting bullies. The courtroom was silent. Judge Whitmore leaned back, studying Nate with an intensity that felt less like judgment and more like recognition. From the back of the room came a soft sound. Not a voice. A shuffle. Heads turned. The clinic door opened. Dr. Hale stood there, and beside her, walking slowly, carefully, was Sable. The German Shepherd's movement was measured, each step deliberate. His side was still bandaged, his frame thinner, but his head was high, his eyes clear. He did not pull. He did not strain. He simply walked. The courtroom froze. Sable stopped beside Nate and sat. Once. Judge Whitmore did not react immediately. He watched the dog the way one watched a living argument, one that could not be cross-examined, only understood. "Animal control?" the judge asked quietly. A man stood, flustered. "He's under supervision, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore nodded. "He's behaving." Sable's ears twitched. He remained still. The judge looked back at Nate. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "if your dog were ordered removed from your custody, what would that mean to you?" Nate answered without hesitation. "It would mean losing the one being in my life that never once asked me to compromise who I am." A murmur rippled through the room. Judge Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. Then he ruled. The land claims were denied. The development permits voided pending federal review. Improper influence noted. Charges referred upward. As for Sable, the judge leaned forward. "This court recognizes context," he said. "It recognizes provocation, and it recognizes loyalty." Sable remained motionless. "The dog will remain with his owner." The gavel struck. Once. Outside, the light was sharp and clean, like the world had been rinsed. Lucas Grant left without looking back. Kessler did not. Nate knelt in the courthouse steps, resting his forehead briefly against Sable's. "You're home," he whispered. Sable's tail thumped once. Not loud. Enough. Sometimes, the miracle doesn't arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes, it comes quietly, through loyalty that refuses to break, through truth that survives pressure, through ordinary people who choose what is right even when it costs them something they love. We often look for God in the dramatic moments, in the instant rescue or the sudden victory. But more often, God works in the spaces we overlook, in a faithful heart that stands firm, in a wounded companion who keeps trusting, in a light that stays on when the world asks us to turn it off. In our daily lives, we are given the same choice Nathan faced, not always between land and law, or danger and safety, but between silence and courage, convenience and integrity. Every time we protect what is good, every time we refuse to trade our values for comfort, we take part in that quiet miracle. If this story moved you, consider who might need to hear it today. Share it with someone who is standing at a hard crossroads. Leave a comment about what this story reminded you of, or where you're watching from. And if you want more stories about faith, loyalty, and justice that begins in the smallest places, subscribe to this channel. May God watch over your home, guide your choices, and give you strength when the right path feels lonely. May His peace find you in both the calm days and the difficult ones.